We had a really bad week at Scrubs where we found 3 men hanging in the same week. I remember walking past his cell and just having a feeling that maybe I should look in. And I could just see his legs dangling. And the worst bit about that wasn't the ligature and it wasn't his neck. He just screamed at me, "Let me die." So I grew up in a rural part of Cambridgeshire, deep in the fens. Not a whole lot going on there, nice and chilled. Had a really great childhood, loved school. I don't remember ever thinking about prison when I was younger. It's certainly not the kind of thing that I imagine most people think, oh, one day I'll want to be a prison officer. I never had that thought myself. But having said that, I was into true crime. I was interested in that kind of thing. I think I was curious probably as I got older, and you perhaps read a bit more about prisons or you hear things in the news. But what was interesting to me was the stories of it. I love people's stories. I'm really interested in real life stories, and I always have been. That's definitely my kind of thing. And that's one thing you can say about prison and the people inside, both staff and prisoners, is that those places are just full of stories and real life and the real world, even though that's not very palatable for some people, but that's the truth of it.
How did you come to work in prison?
So after I finished school, I went to uni for a bit and I hated it. The culture, everything just wasn't for me. So I stayed a couple of months, spent my entire student loan and left. And I remember feeling a bit lost. I wasn't really sure what I was meant to be doing. I worked in my friend's bar for a couple of years, which was fun, but I just didn't really feel like I was meant to be there. I didn't feel like I was contributing much, or, I'd had bigger kind of ambitions for myself, but I didn't really know where that lay. And so I thought I would volunteer at the Young Offenders, or I'd apply to volunteer. I think I was 19 at this point, had a couple of weeks training, and then I started on a mentoring program with young offenders. So it was quite basic things like helping people talk about employment, learning to write a CV, measuring your income and outgoings, that kind of thing. But once I settled into that mentoring role, I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed being there. It was probably the highlight of my week.
And why did you decide to go for official kind of role as a prison officer?
So I had seen some of the prison officers working at Littlehey and Peterborough. They were just so smart. They were so emotionally intelligent. They could read the room in seconds. They knew the people they were working with really well. It just gave me a much bigger insight into what that job's really about. And it is about building relationships with people, being able to pick up on the tiniest things, becoming really attuned to your environment, seeing things that volunteers like me would never see, would never know to look for. And I was really impressed by it. And it was the first time I thought maybe that's something I could do. When I applied to be a prison officer, back then they would assign you to the jail you were going. And I was like 99% sure they'll assign me to Littlehey because that was where I'd been for a long time. But instead they assigned me to Whitemoor, which is a high security category A men's dispersal prison in Cambridgeshire, which was the last place I wanted to go. I can remember really well that first day. And I remember the uniform is just not designed for women. And I remember my trousers were too short and my boots were massive and the jacket was just knee length. And I was so nervous. And at that prison, then you would queue up outside and wait to go in. So it's really intimidating from the get-go because everything is obviously about security. So there's dogs and they're huge dogs and they're not very nice. And there's big signs everywhere saying don't go within 8 foot of these dogs. And then people would be whispering in my ear, actually leave it about 10, 12 feet. And there's loads of staff. There's these huge red alarm bells on the wall. There's signs everywhere saying no guns, no bombs allowed. Pretty obvious. But the whole thing, it just reminds you constantly of where you are. And to be honest, the first 6 months of that job, I just hated. I was so nervous just getting out of my car and going in and walking on the wing. And when they'd shout unlock, I'd be there with my key. It can be a really scary environment when you're not familiar with it. And I was 22 at the time and had thought that this was what I really wanted to do. And then I get there and I thought maybe not.
What were the types of crimes that the prisoners you were working with in this high security prison had committed?
So high secure, I think the minimum sentence on my wing was around, well, the majority of them were serving around 25 to 30 years for life. So that's minimum tariffs. A few were serving natural life sentences, so whole life. So it's as you'd expect. It's things like murder, multiple murder, terrorism, organised crime, that kind of thing. You know, there are some people who they've done the worst of the worst. You know, they are those guys, some of them. And they kind of acted the part as well. A few of them, not many. And I think, though, intellectually, rationally, I know there is no such thing as evil. On an emotional level, when you sometimes are up close with those people and you see the way they carry themselves, and some people have a real attitude of contempt for the system, for everyone around them. But after a while, I kind of lost interest. You know, initially it was a bit of a case of, I think I've seen this person on the news. I'm pretty sure there's a documentary about that person. But very quickly it becomes where you go to work. It's literally your workplace and these other people that you work with. And all those sort of extenuating factors, they just kind of fade into the background. And I lost interest in that, really. I was more interested in the actual people as opposed to the things that they'd done.
How long were you there for then?
I was there for about 3 years, and then I went for promotion for a senior officer role at Wormwood Scrubs in West London. I wanted to get out of my little rural town and go somewhere else. So it was a massive culture shock for me. For a start, it's enormous. Whitemore only held around 400 men. Scrubs held over 1,300 at that time. And it housed everyone. So young offenders, adults, short-termers, lifers, people on remand, sentenced. It was a real mix, and over time that became a real toxic mix. And it's a really old building, so it was built in the 1800s. The infrastructure is challenged. Some of the real contemporary features of prisons like Whitemore, so things like steel window cages on cell windows, they don't have them. Things fluctuated a lot of Scrubs. The whole prisoner population was estimated to turn over in about 10 weeks then. So you had a really fluid in and out all the time. It was a really, really busy jail. Which keeps you busy as a member of staff, but it comes with a lot of challenges as well.
Wormwood's got a fairly bad reputation, or it's kind of like notorious, isn't it? Why do you think it's got that reputation?
I think Scrubs had a reputation then just because it's held some really famous people. I mean, I say famous, notorious people like Ian Brady and those kind of individuals were there. George Blake, he escaped from Scrubs. It's been in a lot of like pop culture. I think it was in poetry, literature, films. It's got a very iconic gatehouse. So I think that probably helps contribute to its notoriety. And for the first year at Scrubs, busy. Far more incidents in the first, I'd say, 2 months at Scrubs than I ever had in the years I'd been at Whitemore. But it was much more a reflection of what the actual prison system is like.
And what were the kinds of incidences that you were dealing with, Alex?
All the things you'd realistically expect to encounter in that first year we came across. So lots of violence, lots of prisoner-on-prisoner fights, a few staff assaults, but not that many. Unfortunately, a lot of self-harm. The first year, it was quite typical for that kind of thing. There was loads of phones. I remember sometimes I'd come on in the morning and you'd hear phones ringing. Phones, obviously, you're not allowed to have a phone in prison, and you'd hear the mobile phones ringing. Or you'd come in the morning and you'd smell the drugs. And that was new to me. So Whitemore wasn't like that. And because we had so much more resources there, if there had been any intelligence of drugs and phones, you could really jump on that there. But at Scrubs, you were surrounded by it. A huge part of my day was trying to get phones and drugs.
How did you go about doing that?
I mean, people have some pretty innovative methods of getting them in. But even that it's really challenging in a lower security prison because, for example, in the higher security prisons, you have what they would call the boss chair, which is the body orifice scanning system. So literally people sit on it, it scans you, and then you know if they've got something. They call it plugged, but, plugged. But we didn't have those resources at Scrubs. So it was difficult. A lot of the time it was your standard trying to search, mirrors under the beds, mirrors down the toilets to see if it was in the U-bend, that kind of thing. I remember in a different room once they found a whole bottle of Jack Daniels and an iPad. I remember one of the more creative ways that they got things in was People on the outside would catch pigeons and rats, gut them, stuff them full of drugs and phones, throw them back over the wall, and hope they'd land on the excise yard. Because there were so many rats and pigeons there, if you saw somebody just sweeping up a dead one, your suspicion wouldn't necessarily be aroused by that. I do remember once one of my colleagues found some drugs that had been hidden in the wall. Like I said, it's a really old prison, so the brickwork was some of it literally crumbling, and they could use plastic knives and forks to kind of dig bits out. And one of my colleagues found some drugs that was over 25 grand in street value. And then in the second half of my time there was when we started to see more and more drones. That had been really rare at the time, the kind of thing you'd all talk about for a few days if there'd been a drone, but it got to the point where we'd come in the mornings and there would be drones crashed on the yard and just pieces scattered everywhere. I remember being on the yard once with an officer and we could just hear that really distinctive humming noise, and we looked up and there was one right above us. So it's kind of, it feels a bit like game over when there's drones for a prison officer, because you're so limited as to what you can do. So you don't carry anything that can necessarily send a drone flying to the ground. And the main time when drones will come is at night, when there's less staff, when it's dark, when everyone's banged up and in their cell. So you don't have the option of intervening so much there anyway. The thing is, for everything that we found, say for every phone that we found, there would have been 10 more. And we knew that. And I can remember there was a particular group of guys on the Fours landing at Wormwood Scrubs. They just ran the phones and we all knew it. But there wasn't a whole lot we could do. It was literally a case of, if you managed to get a phone off them, if you found the phone, they were fine about it. They wouldn't fight. You found the phone, fine. They'd hand it over. They'd take their punishment, which was always the same, no TV. But as soon as you leave for the day, you can look back, you see someone passing them a TV through the cell window.
What types of drugs were at Wormwood Scrubs when you were there?
I do remember there was just a huge drug problem, and it was kind of divided into two camps. So we had 4 landings on the wing that I worked on. And the 2 bottom stories were for people who were typically kind of involved in selling drugs. And then the 2 upper landings were for drug addicts, which is obviously a really toxic mix. And those 2 upper landings were really kind of desperate places to be sometimes, and people would do absolutely anything to get their hands on drugs. I remember there was a phase where with the old style TVs, before we had flat screens, people would take their pills from the nurse, go back, vomit them up, and then put the vomit on the back of the TV where the motor was. The heat made it solidify, and then they'd sell them on as pills. And I'd never seen or come into contact with anything like that, but I saw real just desperation from the amount of drug use in those places. And there just didn't feel like a whole lot that we could do to prevent it. There was some programs of providing methadone and Subutex and other heroin substitutes. But a lot of the time what I saw was people who just became addicted to those and then took heroin anyway. So it felt like a really desperate place at times. And in the last sort of 12 months of my time at Scrubs, spice was becoming a really big thing. Sometimes they called it Mamba. And it got to the point where there were so many ambulances coming in every day to Scrubs for these incidents that the staff were calling them ambulances. It was just constant. And some of that was really sad. It was really devastating seeing how spice just destroyed people's lives.
What violence did you see during your time in prison?
I do remember a particular incident at Scrubs. And I came out of my office and we had an association period. So probably about 150 guys were out at the same time. And I saw 2 prisoners that I didn't know, because you don't have the time to get to know people. And at first I thought they were dancing. It looked like they were kind of 2-stepping with each other. And then I realized they were fighting, but that was normal. So I shouted fight and someone hit the alarm bell. And then for some reason, it just exploded in a second. It went from 0 to 100. I mean, I later found out that it had been planned, but it felt like people just came out of nowhere. So typically with fights, you might have 2 or 3, and then everyone kind of watches until it's over. But people just flew out of cells. I remember people just had their hands in their waistbands, taking out God knows what kind of weapon, and it just exploded. And it was the first time in my career that I called an all available staff. It's literally like making me shake remembering it. And I shouted on my radio, all available staff. And then so it sets off a different alarm bell. And the lights are flashing and the sirens going, and it was just absolute chaos. And there was this guy in the middle, kind of curled up, like in the fetal position. And they had pool balls in socks and mugs. It was just awful. It was awful. It was the first time, I think, I realized that we had just lost control. Like we were not in control of that situation at all. And previously, prisons run to an extent on goodwill because you will always be outnumbered as an officer. That's why those relationships are so important. But we were way past the point of that. And I can remember the noise. So when you rack your baton as an officer, it makes a really distinctive clicking noise. And when one officer does that, it's kind of like a signal to everybody else. We all do the same now. And I just remember all these click, 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 click. And everyone had drawn their baton, but it was chaos. I think probably it only lasted about maybe 10, 15 minutes, but that feels like a really, really long time when you're in the middle of it. And after that incident, I remember 2 officers handed their notice in. One guy was hospitalized. It was chaos. I think that was the worst fight I ever saw, not necessarily because of the levels of violence, because they become quite typical, but just the way it exploded so quickly.
How do prisoners make their own weapons? What kind of homemade weapons did you see during your career as a prison officer?
I think probably the most normal one was razor blades in toothbrushes. They melt the razor blade in. It sounds strange, but that was quite common. Probably the most innovative ones I saw was when people would spend ages sharpening chicken bones and they become really sharp. They were effectively like a knife. Yeah, and also sometimes at Scrubs, they would put razor blades in apples and then throw them out the window onto the excise yard and just kind of aim for the right person. I didn't fully appreciate it, I think. I mean, I knew it was a really dangerous environment. But after I left there, I saw another guy at my 3rd jail who I'd known from Scrubs, who I used to talk to a lot at Scrubs. And he said to me, you know, every time I saw you at Scrubs, I had a flick knife on me. He said every single time we spoke, I had one.
How much of a problem was self-harm during your time as a prison officer?
So I hardly saw any of it at Whitemoor. But generally the regimes there were better. So people were out of their cells more, which is massive for obvious reasons. If you're stuck in a really small room for 23 hours a day, you have a lot of time to think. You perhaps want to take things you shouldn't take, which distort your mind as well. So Scrubs was really bad for it, and it got worse and worse and worse. Yeah, I remember there was a few particular incidents there that were really bad. But I remember one guy on one wing, a new officer came to me and said, I think there's a problem in that cell. So I went to the cell and we opened the door and he had cut his wrists, and it was like out of a film. It was literally dripping from the ceiling. It was everywhere. And it's all a bit of a blur, but you know, before long, there were a few of us in there. There wasn't that many officers on shift, but there were a few of us in there. And the blood just wouldn't stop coming. And then we realized he'd cut his throat as well. And that was the worst self-harm I ever saw by far. And at that time, Holloway had just recently closed. So a lot of the staff from Holloway had been moved to men's jails like Scrubs. And there was a female officer in there with me who was amazing. And Holloway is kind of known for self-harm, or that was definitely one of the biggest challenges they had with the women there. And I remember afterwards, she said to me that she had never seen anything like that. And I thought, God, if you've never seen anything like that. But I don't know, there's something about the intensity of those incidents and the adrenaline of it that once it's calmed down after a while, you could kind of make yourself go back to normal. I don't really know how. But then we had a really bad week at Scrubs where we found 3 men hanging in the same week. And the first one passed away. And the second, we got in there sort of just in time, and he survived, but he suffered brain damage. And then the third, it was strange because he never really caused issues. And I remember walking past his cell and just having a feeling that maybe I should look in. And I could just see his legs dangling. So we went in and he hadn't ligatured himself for very long, so we were in time. But the worst bit about that wasn't the ligature and it wasn't his neck. He just screamed at me, "Let me die." Just over and over again, just scream, "Let me die." And then after that, I felt like a weird kind of guilt because I can remember his name. I can't remember the name of the person who died. I can't even remember what he looked like. I can't remember the name of the person who had brain damage, and you'd think those would be the ones that would stay with you. But I think with the third person and him, he just wanted to die. I think I just never seen that level of distress, so like visceral and in your face, and just, I remember really thinking like, what are we doing? Like, we lock people up for 23 hours a day. Like, I didn't want to be complicit in this kind of, I knew how good prison can be. I was like, strange as that sounds, I knew that people can find their potential there and they can make opportunities out of terrible situations and they can do well. And I thought, how is this? You know, this isn't containment, this isn't rehabilitation. I don't know what this is, but yeah, so the self-harm and suicide, the worst I saw was at Scrubs.
How long were you at Wormwood Scrubs for?
Just under 2 years.
And then where did you go from there?
So then I went to Belmarsh, which is in Thamesmead.
And what was Belmarsh like?
Belmarsh was great. It was completely different to Scrubs, but that was what I needed. Scrubs was chaos. By that point, we were finding real knives on the wing. We'd had a couple of really serious incidents where people had been stabbed multiple times with actual knives. It had become so unsafe, such a dangerous place to be. And for staff, we all felt it. We were all really conscious of it. The cuts to staffing had been catastrophic. You know, sometimes we were unlocking a wing of 317 for no longer than 40 minutes because we didn't have any staff. So it had become a really unsafe place to be, and I could feel how stressed I was becoming being there. So I went back to high security conditions. I moved to Belmarsh, which is modern. It was built in the 90s. It's clean. I remember going in there and they had such a surplus of bedding that at night they would put bed sheets over the pool tables to keep the felt nice. And where I'd come from at Scrubs, you know, there were times we would just give people towels because we didn't have any bedding to give them. And we never had any toilet rolls, so people would use Bible pages. There were so many rats, so many mice that they would roll towels up underneath their door to stop them coming in the cells at night. So when I went to Belmarsh, I was so impressed by the fact that they had more than one bed sheet on the wing. It just felt like a properly functioning prison again. So the first 2 years out of those final 5 were great. But over time, the cuts hit the Category A estate as well. By the last 2 years, I knew that it was time for me to go. I didn't feel productive there at all. When I first joined the job at Whitemore, there was an officer who sat down with me and he was giving me really good advice. And he said things like, don't do too much overtime, always take your holiday, keep your friends outside, don't just make your social circle only officers. And he gave me really good advice. And he said, you know, the job will change you. And I remember thinking, I don't think it has. But, you know, he knows what he's talking about. And he told me that there was a time when he had been in the job a long time and he hadn't realized how much it had begun to affect him. And then he drove to work one day and he couldn't get out of the car. And he said he couldn't make his legs work. And then I remember I went to Texas to look at prisons out there and kind of when I was at Belmarsh. And one of the prisons we went to was death row, the Polunsky unit. So we went onto the actual death row unit and then the death chamber itself. And I was speaking to the correctional officers whose job it was to walk the condemned prisoner from their final cell to the death chamber. And I said, what's the hardest part of your job? And I kind of thought I knew what they were going to say because it seems obvious. And I remember they said that you have 3 scenarios when you're walking those prisoners. And the first one is that they fight and you have to physically restrain them in order to get them to the gurney. And the second one is when they're passive and they just walk. And they said the worst bit is the third scenario when they are apologetic, but they have to be carried because they say, I can't make my legs work. And I remembered that because obviously it mirrored what that officer had said. And then I think I've been at Belmarsh about 3 or 4 years. And we'd had a couple of deaths and incidents that weren't more violent than others really, but it was obviously starting to have an impact on me. And I drove home. I lived in a nice little street in South London at the time, and I pulled up outside my flat and I just stayed in the car for like 3 hours, and it was cold, but I just stayed in the car. And I remember thinking then, like, I can't make my legs work. Like, I can't get in. So I think I'd been telling myself for a long time, this will get better, like it will go back to what it used to be. I will feel safe. I will enjoy work again. It will have that energy and that rhythm, and I'll feel productive. And then I just think that was my body's way of saying, like, you have to go now. It's not going to change. So I think that was the moment I realised it was time for me to finish.
And how did you feel after leaving?
I kind of like fought it for a while because it was all I'd done. I'd done it since I was 22, and obviously I volunteered for a long time before then. And it sounds strange, but prisons had become like quite familiar to me, and they were where I felt comfortable, and I knew how things worked. So I was worried about leaving. I thought, what am I going to do? I felt like it was tied up with my identity really. But honestly, from the moment I walked out, like, I slept better, I ate better, I exercised more. I think when the time is right, like it's not working for you anymore. And I think, it's interesting, a report came out last year saying that in 2023, prison staff took over 700 years worth of mental health sick leave. So not physical and mental, just mental health sick leave, and just in 12 months. But the impact on staff gets lost a lot. And I think people become so invested in these jobs. They know their skills. They know they can do really positive things there. And yeah, I think it's a really sad indictment of where we are that we've just lost that.
What kind of prison officer were you?
Yeah, I would like to think I was a good prison officer. I think I was fair. I think I was firm, but I was interested in people, genuinely interested in people. And I learned, very early on in my career, I was much more black and white, and I was sort of told to be that way, And then as time progressed and I became much more confident in the way I worked, I felt able to kind of use grey areas more.
Can you tell me a bit about some of the people that you had an impact on during your time as a prison officer?
I can remember one specific person who I met in my first prison, and I remember when he came on the wing, he was covered in tattoos and he just looked terrifying, and I thought, you look terrifying, I'm going to keep away from you. And on probably one of his first days on the wing, I was detailed to the area that he lived on, near his cell. And he came out of his cell and he sat on the stairs, which we really stuck to health and safety there, so that's not allowed. And I remember I was the nearest officer to him, and I was thinking, oh. And I looked up and I saw this other officer looking at me, and he was like, off you go. And so I, go up to this guy who's enormous and covered in tattoos, and I said, you need to come off the stairs. And he just looked at me and he went, no. I was thinking, oh God. And the officer up there is like, smiling. Sort of like psyched myself up a bit, and I was like, you need to get up now. And there was just like silence for a minute, and I'm like sweating profusely. And he just went, okay then. And he just got up like it was nothing. And he had a bit of a reputation, he was quite an intimidating person. But he was someone that I ended up knowing in all 3 prisons that I worked at. He was a lifer, but he got moved around quite a lot. And by the end of those 9 years, I tried to make the effort to go and see him probably once a week. And we would just talk. We'd just stand on his wing and just talk. And we got on really well by that point. And then I got a call from reception one day saying, this person is leaving, he's being shipped out. Obviously, you don't get much notice for that. And he'd asked if I'd come and say goodbye. And so I was trying to kind of manage things. I had a lot to do. I was really busy, and I eventually get down there, but I got down there just as his bus had left. So I just missed him. And the SO, the senior officer in reception, said, oh, he had a message for you. He said, thank you for being my friend. I remember that got me a bit, because he represented the very scary early days of my career. And then, over a course of a long period of time, and it had taken a long time, and that's why experience is so important in prison. We had developed a really strong relationship, and that obviously meant something to me, but it felt like it meant something to him too. So, but yeah, I think it was clarification for me, like just reaffirmed to me that even when things were really bad and I was really stressed and, I can't get out of my car or whatever, there were times when I did good and I did some really good work, and I'm really proud of that.
A car pulled up next to me, the window wound down. I got chucked a package into my car, which was yay big, and then I got chucked £400 in rolled up notes. To which point I'm sat in a car then thinking, what have I just done?